March 15th, 1967, Firebase Charlie, Mekong Delta. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien stared down at his rotting jungle boots, the expensive leather already falling apart after just 2 weeks in Vietnam's punishing heat and humidity. The 47 military-issue footwear that had seemed so advanced back at Fort Benning now squelched with every step. The supposedly waterproof leather cracking like old parchment under the relentless assault of monsoon rains and jungle rot. Across the firebase perimeter, he watched a captured Viet Cong fighter calmly walking through ankle-deep mud, his simple tire sandal footwear cutting through the muck without a sound. The prisoner's feet looked healthier than those of half O'Brien's platoon, who were already suffering from various tropical foot ailments. The American sergeant shook his head in bitter irony, remembering how his men had laughed at those crude sandals just days earlier. What O'Brien didn't yet realize was that he was witnessing the beginning of one of the most humbling lessons in military history. The United States military entered Vietnam with unprecedented confidence in its technological superiority. Behind every piece of equipment issued to American soldiers lay years of research, development, and testing that had cost taxpayers millions of dollars. The Jungle Boot program alone represented a triumph of modern military engineering, or so the Pentagon believed. The standard-issue tropical combat boot had been developed specifically for Southeast Asian conditions, after extensive field testing in Panama's jungles. Military contractors had spent 3 years perfecting the design, incorporating lessons learned from World War II Pacific campaigns and Korean War experiences. The boots featured full-grain leather uppers treated with special waterproofing compounds, nylon fabric panels for ventilation, and direct molded soles designed to provide traction on wet surfaces. Each pair cost the military $47 in 1967 dollars, equivalent to over $400 today. The procurement process involved multiple layers of quality assurance, from initial material specifications to final inspection protocols. Leather had to meet strict standards for thickness, flexibility, and water resistance. The waterproofing treatment involved a complex chemical process that sealed the leather pores while supposedly maintaining breathability. Steel shanks provided arch support, while cushioned insoles promised comfort during long marches. Military quartermasters took pride in the sophisticated supply chain that delivered these boots to soldiers worldwide. From the tanneries in Wisconsin to the manufacturing plants in Missouri, every step was monitored and documented. Quality control inspectors examined random samples from each batch, testing them for durability, water resistance, and compliance with military specifications. The boots underwent rigorous testing protocols, including submersion tests, stress tests, and simulated wear trials. The confidence extended beyond just footwear. American military doctrine in the 1960s was built on the assumption that superior technology would overcome any disadvantage in numbers or local knowledge. The same thinking that produced B-52 bombers and M16 rifles also influenced boot design. If it was more complex, more expensive, and required more sophisticated manufacturing processes, it had to be better. Soldiers arriving in Vietnam initially shared this confidence. Fresh recruits from basic training had been issued their jungle boots with pride, told they represented the finest military footwear ever produced. The boots felt substantial on their feet, well-constructed and professional. Drill sergeants had emphasized the importance of proper foot care and the superior protection these boots would provide in combat conditions. The psychological impact of superior equipment cannot be understated. American soldiers believed their gear gave them a decisive advantage over an enemy they viewed as technologically primitive. This confidence extended from their weapons to their communications equipment to their footwear. They were the best-equipped military force in history, backed by the world's most advanced industrial economy. Military training manuals emphasized the importance of maintaining equipment according to specifications. Soldiers learned detailed procedures for cleaning, waterproofing, and caring for their boots. They were taught that proper maintenance would ensure their equipment performed as designed, providing the reliability and durability promised by manufacturers. The boots themselves seemed to validate this confidence during stateside training. They performed well in temperate climates and controlled conditions. Soldiers completing basic training and advanced individual training praised their comfort and durability. Even early training exercises in humid conditions like those at Fort Polk, Louisiana, seemed to confirm the boots' effectiveness. What the military's extensive testing hadn't fully accounted for was the unique combination of extreme humidity, constant moisture, and corrosive jungle environments that defined combat conditions in Vietnam. The gap between laboratory testing and battlefield reality was about to become painfully apparent to thousands of American soldiers. The tire sandal, known in Vietnamese as Dep Lop, represented generations of practical wisdom born from necessity. Unlike the American military's multi-million-dollar footwear development program, Vietnamese tire sandals evolved organically. From the simple need to make something from nothing, a skill that had kept rural Vietnamese communities moving for decades, the history of tire. Sandals stretched back to French colonial rule, when discarded automobile and bicycle tires began appearing along Vietnam's roads in significant numbers. Rural Vietnamese, always resourceful in the face of poverty, quickly recognized the potential in these rubber scraps. The tire's natural properties, waterproof, flexible, and incredibly durable, made it ideal. Material for footwear in a country where the majority of the population worked in rice paddies and lived in constant contact with water and mud. The construction process was elegantly simple. A skilled craftsman could fashion a pair of tire sandals in less than an hour using only basic tools. The tire tread was cut to approximate foot size, with careful attention paid to preserving the original tread pattern for maximum traction. Holes were punched through the rubber to accommodate straps, which were typically made from inner tube rubber cut into strips. Some sandals incorporated wire or cord for additional durability, but the basic design required nothing more sophisticated than a sharp knife and a crude awl. This simplicity masked sophisticated design principles that military engineers would later struggle to replicate. The open design provided maximum ventilation, allowing feet to dry quickly in humid conditions. The flexible rubber sole conformed to uneven terrain, while the tire tread provided superior grip on wet surfaces. Most importantly, the sandals were completely waterproof, not through chemical treatment, but through the inherent properties of vulcanized rubber. The cultural context surrounding tire sandals reflected broader Vietnamese values of resourcefulness and adaptation. In a society where waste was unthinkable and every material had potential value, transforming discarded tires into functional footwear represented both practical intelligence and cultural identity. Vietnamese farmers had worn variations of these sandals for decades before American soldiers ever set foot in the country. The craftsmanship involved in making quality tire sandals was passed down through generations. Experienced sandal makers could evaluate a tire's suitability at a glance, selecting rubber with the right balance of flexibility and durability. They understood which tread patterns worked best for different conditions. Deeper treads for muddy terrain, shallower patterns for rocky ground. The placement and size of strap holes required precision to ensure comfort and security without compromising the sole's structural integrity. Regional variations reflected local conditions and preferences. Sandals made in the Mekong Delta often featured wider soles and more aggressive tread patterns to handle the region's notorious mud. Mountain versions might incorporate additional strapping for security on steep terrain. Coastal varieties sometimes used lighter rubber for improved comfort on sandy beaches. The economic reality behind tire sandals was stark. For most Vietnamese, a pair of manufactured shoes represented weeks or months of income. Tire sandals, by contrast, could be made for virtually nothing using materials that would otherwise be discarded. This economic necessity drove innovation, forcing craftsmen to maximize performance using minimal resources. What American military observers initially dismissed as primitive improvisation was actually sophisticated, appropriate technology, design, solutions perfectly matched to their intended environment and available resources. The tire sandals represented hundreds of years of collective experience in tropical footwear, refined through countless iterations by people whose lives depended on their effectiveness. The irony was profound. Vietnamese soldiers and civilians had been wearing variations of these sandals for decades, traversing the same jungles that would soon challenge American military footwear. They had already solved the problems that American engineers were still trying to understand. The first patrol into the Mekong Delta's interior should have been routine. Staff Sergeant O'Brien led his squad of 12 soldiers along what intelligence officers had marked as a low-threat reconnaissance route. The morning air hung thick with humidity that seemed to press against their skin like a wet blanket. And by 0800 hours, every man was already soaked in sweat despite the early hour. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez felt his boots squelch with each step as they moved through ankle-deep water that covered most of the trail. The supposedly waterproof jungle boots had begun taking on water within the first mile, and now his feet sloshed audibly with every movement. Around him, other soldiers were experiencing the same problem, though nobody wanted to be the first to complain about equipment that had cost the military a small fortune. The temperature gauge, clipped to Corporal James Mitchell's pack, read 97 degrees Fahrenheit with 98% humidity. These weren't even extreme conditions by Vietnamese standards, just typical weather for the dry season, but the combination of heat, moisture, and constant water contact created an environment that seemed designed to destroy American military equipment. By the third hour of patrol, the problems were becoming impossible to ignore. Specialist Mike Chen noticed that his boot leather was already showing signs of deterioration, with small cracks appearing along the stress points where the upper met the sole. The supposedly advanced waterproofing treatment was creating its own problems, trapping moisture inside the boot and creating a perfect environment for bacterial growth. The squad's medic, Doc Morrison, was already seeing the early signs of what would become a persistent problem. Soldiers were developing hot spots and blisters as their wet feet rubbed against the interior of their waterlogged boots. The cushioned insoles that had seemed so comfortable during training were now acting like sponges, absorbing and holding moisture against their skin. What made the situation even more frustrating was the presence of their Vietnamese guide, a local villager named Nguyen, who had been hired to help navigate the complex network of waterways and trails. Nguyen moved through the same terrain with effortless grace, his tire sandals making virtually no noise as he stepped through mud and shallow water. His feet remained dry and healthy-looking, while the Americans struggled with increasingly uncomfortable and deteriorating footwear. During a brief rest stop, several soldiers couldn't resist examining Nguyen's sandals more closely. The simple construction was obvious, just pieces of tire rubber held together with inner tube straps. But what impressed them was the functionality. The tread pattern from the original tire provided excellent grip on slippery surfaces, while the open design allowed water to drain immediately rather than accumulating inside the footwear. Private Rodriguez, whose feet were already developing painful blisters, asked Nguyen about his sandals through hand signals in broken Vietnamese. The guide smiled and pointed to a discarded tire visible along the trail, making cutting motions with his hands to indicate how the sandals were made. The simplicity was almost insulting. Here were American soldiers, struggling with sophisticated military equipment while a local villager effortlessly traversed the same terrain, wearing what amounted to recycled garbage. As the patrol continued, the problems multiplied. The wet boots were becoming heavier with each step, adding unnecessary weight to soldiers already carrying 60-pound packs. The constant moisture was breaking down the leather's structural integrity, causing the boots to lose their shape and support. Some soldiers noticed that the steel shanks, designed to provide arch support, were actually causing pressure points as the boots deformed around their feet. The psychological impact was perhaps more significant than the physical discomfort. These soldiers had been trained to believe in the superiority of American military equipment. They had been taught that their gear gave them decisive advantages over a technologically primitive enemy. Now, just days into their deployment, they were watching that confidence erode with each painful step through the Vietnamese countryside. By the time they returned to base that evening, every member of the squad was dealing with foot problems of some kind. Their expensive jungle boots, which had performed perfectly during training in temperate climates, were falling apart in conditions they were supposedly designed to handle. Meanwhile, their Vietnamese guide had completed the same patrol without any apparent discomfort, his simple tire sandals showing no signs of wear or deterioration. The technical reasons behind the tire sandals' superiority became clear only after military engineers began studying the problem seriously. What Vietnamese craftsmen had discovered through trial and error over generations represented sound, engineering principles that American military contractors had somehow overlooked in their sophisticated development process. Rubber's natural properties made it ideally suited for tropical conditions. Unlike leather, which required chemical treatment to achieve even temporary water resistance, vulcanized tire rubber was inherently waterproof. The vulcanization process, which involved treating natural rubber with sulfur and heat, created cross-linked polymer chains that were impervious to water while maintaining flexibility. This wasn't a coating that could wear off or fail. It was the fundamental nature of the material itself. The drainage characteristics of tire sandals solved one of the most persistent problems facing American soldiers. Jungle boots, despite their ventilation panels, were designed as closed systems that inevitably trapped moisture. Even when the boots weren't actively leaking, condensation from sweating feet had nowhere to escape. This trapped moisture created ideal conditions for bacterial and fungal growth, leading to the foot rot and jungle rot that plagued American units. Tire sandals, by contrast, functioned as open systems. Water could enter freely, but it could also exit immediately. Soldiers wearing tire sandals could walk through streams or mud without concern, knowing their feet would be dry within minutes of reaching solid ground. The open design also provided maximum air circulation, helping to prevent the moisture buildup that caused so many problems with conventional footwear. The traction provided by tire treads was another crucial advantage that military engineers had underestimated. Tire manufacturers had spent decades perfecting tread patterns for maximum grip on wet surfaces. The deep channels and angled patterns found on automobile and truck tires were specifically designed to channel water away from the contact surface, providing grip even in slippery conditions. American jungle boots, despite their molded soles, couldn't match this performance. The boot soles were designed as compromises, balancing traction with durability, comfort, and manufacturing cost. Tire treads, by contrast, were designed for a single purpose: maintaining grip under adverse conditions. The rubber compound used in tire manufacturing was also superior to boot sole material, offering better flexibility and grip characteristics. Weight was another factor that became increasingly important during long patrols. A pair of jungle boots weighed approximately 2.8 pounds when dry, and could easily double that weight when saturated with water. Tire sandals, by comparison, weighed less than 8 ounces and couldn't absorb water weight. Over the course of a day-long patrol, this weight difference translated into significant energy savings for soldiers who were already carrying heavy combat loads. The biomechanical advantages of tire sandals were subtle but significant. The flexible sole allowed the foot to function more naturally, with the arch and toes able to adapt to uneven terrain. This natural foot function improved balance and reduced fatigue compared to the rigid support system built into military boots. Vietnamese soldiers could move more quietly because their footwear allowed them to feel the ground surface and adjust their step accordingly. Temperature regulation was another area where tire sandals excelled. The black rubber absorbed heat during the day but dissipated it quickly due to the thin profile and open design. Jungle boots, with their thick leather construction and closed design, acted as insulators that trapped heat and made feet uncomfortably hot in tropical conditions. The maintenance requirements of the two footwear systems were drastically different. Jungle boots required regular cleaning, waterproofing, and careful drying to maintain their effectiveness. Even with proper care, the complex materials and construction made them vulnerable to deterioration. Tire sandals required virtually no maintenance. They could be rinsed clean in seconds and were ready for immediate use. Perhaps most importantly, tire sandals were designed to fail safely. When a strap broke, the sandal could usually still be worn with reduced security. When jungle boots failed, whether through leather degradation, sole separation, or hardware problems, they often became completely unwearable, leaving soldiers with no footwear protection at all. The engineering analysis revealed an uncomfortable truth. Vietnamese tire sandals represented superior appropriate technology, perfectly matched to their operating environment and available resources. The letters home began arriving in American mailboxes throughout the spring of 1967, carrying with them stories that contradicted everything families had been told about their sons' equipment and conditions. Private Rodriguez wrote to his mother in San Antonio, "Ma, these boots they gave us are falling apart after just 1 week. There's a Vietnamese guy who works with us, and his sandals made from old tires look better than our $50 boots. I don't understand how this is possible." Corporal Mitchell's letter to his wife in Ohio was even more direct. "Honey, I know you spent good money on those care packages with foot powder and extra socks, but it doesn't matter what we do. These jungle boots are garbage. Yesterday, I watched a captured VC soldier walk through the same mud that destroyed my boots, and his feet looked healthier than mine. Something's really wrong here." The medical evidence was mounting daily in field hospitals and aid stations throughout South Vietnam. Captain Robert Hayes, a military physician stationed at the 3rd Surgical Hospital in Binh Thuy, documented the growing crisis in his official reports. "We're seeing an epidemic of tropical foot conditions that could be largely preventable with appropriate footwear," he wrote to his superiors. "The current jungle boot issue is creating more casualties than enemy action in some units." Doc Morrison, the squad medic who had witnessed the deterioration firsthand, kept detailed records of foot-related problems in his unit. In just 3 weeks, he had treated 17 cases of immersion foot, 12 cases of fungal infections, and countless blisters and pressure sores directly attributable to inadequate footwear. The irony, he wrote in his journal, is that our Vietnamese interpreters and guides have 0 foot problems, despite working in identical conditions. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore at unit level. First Lieutenant Karen Thompson, one of the few female officers serving in medical support roles, noted in her official reports, "Vietnamese personnel attached to American units consistently show superior foot health despite sharing identical environmental exposures." When questioned, they attribute this to their traditional footwear, which appears to be constructed from discarded vehicle tires. Sergeant Major William Patterson, a career soldier with combat experience in Korea, found himself questioning decades of military wisdom. In a candid letter to a fellow NCO back at Fort Bragg, he wrote, "Bill, I've been in this Army for 18 years, and I've never seen equipment failure on this scale. These kids are suffering because someone back in Washington thought they knew better than people who've been living in this climate for thousands of years. The psychological impact on morale was becoming as significant as the physical problems." Specialist Chen, who had initially taken pride in his military equipment, wrote to his brother, "Everything they told us about our gear being superior is turning out to be wrong. If they're wrong about something as basic as boots, what else are they wrong about? It makes you wonder about the whole war." Individual soldiers began taking matters into their own hands, often in violation of military regulations. Private First Class David Johnson wrote home, "Don't tell anyone, but I traded a carton of cigarettes for a pair of those tire sandals from a local kid. My feet haven't felt this good since I got to this godforsaken place. I wear them on patrol and put the jungle boots back on when we return to base." The cultural awakening was perhaps more significant than the practical problems. These soldiers had arrived in Vietnam with assumptions about American technological superiority that were being challenged daily by observable evidence. Staff Sergeant O'Brien, whose disillusionment had begun with those first rotting boots, wrote to his father, "Dad, I was wrong about these people being primitive. They figured out things we haven't even thought about. Makes you wonder what else we don't know." Medical officers were documenting clear patterns in their casualty reports. Units that had been in country longer showed higher rates of foot-related problems as their equipment continued to deteriorate. Vietnamese personnel attached to American units showed virtually no foot-related medical problems, despite identical exposure to environmental conditions. The correlation was undeniable, even if officially unacknowledged. Captain Hayes found himself in the awkward position of recommending primitive footwear to soldiers under his medical care. "In my professional opinion," he wrote in one report, "personnel suffering from chronic foot conditions should be authorized to use local footwear solutions until appropriate. Military equipment becomes available. The Recommendation was rejected by higher command as inappropriate and damaging to unit morale. The letters home painted a picture of growing frustration and disillusionment that went far beyond footwear. These soldiers had been taught to believe in American technological superiority as an article of faith. Watching that faith crumble under the simple evidence of tire sandals was changing their perspective on everything. About their mission in Vietnam, the military supply chain that had seemed so impressive on paper began breaking down under the reality of Vietnam's conditions. By mid-1967, American units were consuming jungle boots at a rate that military planners had never anticipated. Boots that were expected to last 6 months were failing within weeks, creating a logistical nightmare that stretched from Saigon to the Pentagon. The cost implications were staggering. At $47 per pair, the military had budgeted for approximately 2 pairs of jungle boots per soldier per year. In reality, some soldiers were going through 6 or 8 pairs during their one-year tours. The 25th Infantry Division alone was requesting 15,000 additional pairs of jungle boots per month, more than 3 times the original projection. Quartermaster officers found themselves in impossible positions. Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, Chief Supply Officer for the 1st Cavalry Division, wrote in his efficiency report, "Current jungle boot failure rates are making it impossible to maintain adequate footwear inventory. Soldiers are being issued boots that are known to be inadequate, because no alternatives exist within the military supply system. The bureaucratic response to the crisis revealed deep flaws in military procurement processes." Rather than acknowledging the equipment failure, Pentagon officials blamed the problems on improper maintenance and harsh field conditions. A directive issued in July 1967 reminded soldiers of their responsibility to properly maintain equipment, according to established procedures. This response infuriated soldiers and field commanders who were watching their equipment disintegrate, despite following maintenance protocols exactly. Major Robert Stevens, a battalion commander in the 101st Airborne, responded to the directive with barely contained anger. "My men are developing preventable medical conditions because their equipment is failing, and headquarters wants to blame them for not taking proper care of it. This is unconscionable." The black market response was swift and predictable. Vietnamese entrepreneurs quickly recognized the demand for alternative footwear and began manufacturing tire sandals, specifically for American soldiers. These GI Dep Lop featured slightly wider straps and larger sizes to accommodate American feet, while maintaining the basic design principles that made them superior to military boots. Soldiers began trading everything from cigarettes to sea rations for these locally made sandals. Private Rodriguez documented the going rate in his journal. "A carton of Marlboros will get you a really good pair of tire sandals that will last your whole tour. Compare that to jungle boots that fall apart in 3 weeks. It's not even a choice anymore." The unofficial economy created complex moral and disciplinary problems for unit commanders. Technically, soldiers were required to wear issued equipment and could face disciplinary action for using unauthorized gear. In practice, commanders were faced with the choice between enforcing regulations that damaged their soldiers' health or allowing violations that improved unit effectiveness. Captain Mitchell found himself in this impossible position when several of his soldiers appeared for morning inspection wearing tire sandals. "I can't officially approve of you wearing non-issue footwear," he told them, "but I also can't order you to destroy your feet for the sake of regulations that don't make sense." The unofficial policy became, "Don't ask, don't tell," regarding footwear choices. The supply chain problems extended beyond just replacement boots. The military medical system was being overwhelmed by foot-related casualties that could have been prevented with appropriate footwear. Field hospitals were expending significant resources treating conditions that were virtually unknown among Vietnamese personnel working in identical conditions. Some enterprising soldiers began sending tire sandals home as souvenirs, inadvertently creating an intelligence problem. When families received packages containing enemy footwear that clearly outperformed American military equipment, uncomfortable questions began being asked in congressional offices and newspaper editorial boards. The Pentagon's solution was typically bureaucratic. They commissioned a study to determine why jungle boots were failing at unexpected rates. The study, conducted by military contractors who had a vested interest in defending their products, concluded that failure rates were within acceptable parameters given unusual environmental stresses. This conclusion was immediately contradicted by field reports from medical officers and unit commanders. The disconnect between official findings and battlefield reality created a credibility gap that extended far beyond footwear issues. Soldiers began questioning other equipment and policy decisions, wondering what else the military establishment might be wrong about. The procurement disaster was becoming a symbol of larger problems with American military thinking in Vietnam. The assumption that expensive, sophisticated equipment was inherently superior to simple, locally adapted solutions was being challenged daily by observable evidence. Yet the institutional response was denial rather than adaptation, setting the stage for even greater problems as the war continued. The tire sandal revelation marked a turning point in how many American soldiers viewed their Vietnamese counterparts and opponents. What had begun as a simple equipment problem was evolving into a fundamental challenge to American assumptions about cultural and technological superiority. Staff. Sergeant O'Brien found himself studying his Vietnamese guide with new respect during their daily patrols. Nguyen wasn't just wearing better footwear. He was demonstrating a level of environmental adaptation that American soldiers were struggling to match. The guide could read weather patterns, identify edible plants, and navigate complex terrain using landmarks that were invisible to American eyes. I started paying attention to everything Nguyen did, O'Brien wrote in his journal. The way he moved through the jungle, the way he could tell you what the weather would be like tomorrow just by looking at the sky, the way he never seemed to get lost even when all the trails looked identical to us. This guy knows things we don't even know we don't know. The realization extended beyond individual expertise to broader cultural patterns. Vietnamese soldiers and civilians displayed problem-solving approaches that American military doctrine didn't recognize or value. They prioritized adaptability over standardization, local knowledge over theoretical training, and practical effectiveness over institutional prestige. Private Chen, who had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, found himself thinking about his own family's immigrant experience. Well, my grandfather always said Americans thought Chinese people were backward because we did things differently, he wrote to his cousin. Now I'm seeing the same thing here. These Vietnamese aren't primitive. They're solving problems we can't even identify. The cultural awakening wasn't limited to admiration for enemy ingenuity. American soldiers began recognizing the limitations of their own training and worldview. They had been taught to rely on superior firepower and technology to overcome any disadvantage. But Vietnam was presenting problems that couldn't be solved through brute force or expensive equipment. Corporal Mitchell, who had initially dismissed tire sandals as crude improvisation, found himself fascinated by the broader philosophy they represented. Back home, if something breaks, you throw it away and buy a new one, he wrote to his wife. Here, nothing gets thrown away. Everything gets used until it falls apart, and then the pieces get used for something else. Maybe we could learn something from that. The respect was gradually becoming mutual. Vietnamese personnel working with American units began to see individual soldiers differently as those soldiers demonstrated openness to learning local techniques and acknowledging Vietnamese expertise. The traditional power dynamic, Americans as teachers, Vietnamese as students, was slowly being reversed in practical matters. Doc Morrison documented this cultural shift in his medical reports. Soldiers who have adopted local footwear solutions show not only improved physical health, but also better relationships with Vietnamese personnel. The willingness to admit that local solutions might be superior appears to break down barriers and improve cooperation. The psychological impact was profound for soldiers, whose entire military identity had been built around technological superiority. Specialist Johnson wrote home, "Everything we learned in basic training assumed we'd have better equipment than anyone we fought against. When that turns out to be wrong, you start questioning everything else they told you." Some soldiers began actively seeking out Vietnamese knowledge and techniques beyond just footwear. They learned about local foods, navigation methods, and survival techniques that weren't covered in any American military manual. This knowledge often proved more valuable than their formal training when it came to actual survival in Vietnamese conditions. The cultural exchange wasn't entirely one-sided. Vietnamese guides and interpreters were also impressed by certain aspects of American organization, medical knowledge, and technological capabilities. But the tire sandal lesson had established that superiority wasn't automatic or universal. It was specific to particular applications and environments. Unit. Commanders found themselves in delicate positions as their soldiers demonstrated growing respect for Vietnamese capabilities. Official military policy still emphasized American technological and cultural superiority, but battlefield reality was teaching different lessons. The smart commanders quietly encouraged their soldiers to learn whatever would keep them alive and effective. The broader implications were troubling for military planners who had built strategy around assumptions of across-the-board American superiority. If American soldiers could be wrong about something as basic as footwear, what other assumptions might be incorrect? The tire sandal lesson was becoming a crack in the foundation of American military confidence. The tire sandal lesson was just the beginning. As American soldiers became more observant about Vietnamese innovations, they began noticing a broader pattern of simple solutions outperforming sophisticated American technology. The most deadly example was the punji stake, sharpened bamboo spikes that were terrorizing American patrols throughout South Vietnam. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. American engineers had developed elaborate mine detection equipment, metal detectors, and ground-penetrating radar systems to locate enemy explosives. These devices cost thousands of dollars each and required specialized training to operate. Vietnamese fighters, by contrast, were creating equally effective area denial weapons using nothing more than bamboo, human waste, and basic carpentry skills. Punji stakes represented the same design philosophy as tire sandals, appropriate technology using locally available materials. Bamboo grew everywhere in Vietnam, was free for the taking, and could be processed with simple hand tools. The stakes could be prepared quickly by anyone with basic skills, required no sophisticated manufacturing, and were virtually impossible to detect with American equipment designed to find metal objects. The psychological impact of punji stakes far exceeded their actual casualty rates. Soldiers knew that every step through dense vegetation could result in a foot or leg wound from a hidden stake. The constant vigilance required was mentally exhausting and slowed patrol movement to a crawl. American units were being paralyzed by weapons that cost virtually nothing to produce and deploy. Staff Sergeant O'Brien's patrol discovered this reality during a routine sweep operation near Can Tho. Despite using the latest mine detection equipment, they walked into a punji stake field that wounded 3 soldiers in quick succession. The stakes were positioned with sophisticated understanding of how American patrols moved and where soldiers were likely to step when avoiding obvious dangers. The person who set this up knew exactly how we operate. O'Brien reported to his company commander, and they predicted where we'd go when we tried to avoid the obvious traps, and they put stakes exactly where our point man would step. This wasn't random. This was planned by someone who understands our tactics better than we understand theirs. The medical treatment for punji stake wounds revealed another dimension of Vietnamese tactical sophistication. The stakes were often coated with human feces or allowed to rot in stagnant water, ensuring that even minor punctures would become infected. American soldiers required extensive medical treatment and evacuation for wounds that would have been trivial if clean, turning every punji stake into a potential casualty generator. Vietnamese booby traps extended far beyond punji stakes. Simple deadfall traps using logs and stones could disable vehicles or injure personnel. Crossbow traps, activated by tripwires, were nearly silent and used no gunpowder or metal components that might be detected by American sensors. Fish hooks attached to nearly invisible fishing line could cause painful facial injuries to soldiers pushing through vegetation. The cost differential was humiliating. A single American anti-personnel mine cost approximately $30 and required sophisticated manufacturing processes, quality control, and logistic support. A punji stake trap that could disable a soldier just as effectively cost nothing and could be manufactured by anyone with access to bamboo and basic tools. The strategic implications were profound. Vietnamese forces were creating area denial weapons using materials that couldn't be interdicted, manufacturing processes that couldn't be bombed, and techniques that could be taught to any rural villager. American strategy was based on controlling supply lines and destroying manufacturing capability. But how do you bomb a bamboo grove or destroy a manufacturing process that requires only hand tools? The pattern was becoming clear to observant soldiers. Vietnamese ingenuity wasn't limited to footwear. They were systematically outthinking American technology across multiple domains, using creativity and local knowledge to neutralize expensive American advantages. The medical evidence was becoming impossible to ignore by summer. 1967, field hospitals throughout South Vietnam were documenting patterns of foot-related casualties that painted a clear picture of equipment failure on an unprecedented scale. The statistics were damning for American military procurement and embarrassing for commanders, who had initially dismissed soldiers' complaints. Captain Robert Hayes at the 3rd Surgical Hospital began maintaining detailed records that would later become crucial evidence in congressional hearings. His data showed that foot-related medical evacuations had increased by 340% compared to Korean War rates, despite supposedly improved equipment and better understanding of tropical medicine. The numbers told a story that no amount of official spin could obscure. In a typical week, we're treating more American soldiers for preventable foot conditions than for combat wounds, Dr. Hayes wrote in his official medical reports. These are not complex tropical diseases. They're basic problems of moisture, friction, and bacterial infection that are being caused by inadequate footwear. Meanwhile, Vietnamese personnel working alongside American units show virtually zero incidents of these conditions. The contrast in foot health between American and Vietnamese personnel was so stark that medical officers began conducting informal comparative studies. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Williams, Chief Medical Officer for the 25th Infantry Division, documented her observations in clinical detail. Vietnamese interpreters, scouts, and support personnel attached to American units consistently demonstrate superior foot health. Despite identical environmental exposure and often greater physical demands, the types of conditions plaguing American soldiers read like a textbook of preventable tropical foot ailments. Immersion foot, caused by prolonged exposure to moisture, was epidemic among soldiers whose supposedly waterproof boots had failed. Fungal infections thrived in the warm, moist environment created by non-breathable leather boots. Bacterial infections, often starting from simple blisters, were becoming serious medical problems requiring evacuation and intensive treatment. Doc Morrison, now treating his 2nd company of soldiers, kept meticulous records that revealed the progression of the problem. Week 1, the boots start leaking. Week 2, blisters form as wet feet rub against wet leather. Week 3, the blisters become infected. Week 4, we've got a medical evacuation and a soldier who's out of action for 2 weeks minimum. The psychological impact on soldiers was being documented by military psychiatrists who were seeing unprecedented numbers of troops requesting medical evaluation for foot problems. Many soldiers were convinced they had contracted exotic tropical diseases, not realizing their problems were caused by equipment failure. The constant pain and discomfort was affecting morale and combat effectiveness in measurable ways. Colonel Williams began conducting controlled observations that bordered on clinical research. She arranged for Vietnamese personnel to be examined by American medical staff, documenting their foot health using the same standards applied to American soldiers. The results were unambiguous. Vietnamese feet showed none of the pathological conditions that were plaguing American troops. The Vietnamese subjects showed healthy skin, no signs of fungal infection, minimal callousing, and excellent overall foot health, she reported. When questioned about their footwear, they universally attributed their foot health to the ventilation and drainage characteristics of tire sandals. Several subjects had worn the same sandals for over a year, with no maintenance beyond occasional rinsing. The economic cost of foot-related medical problems was staggering. Each medical evacuation cost approximately $2,000 in 1967 dollars, not including lost combat effectiveness and replacement personnel costs. The 1st Infantry Division alone was spending more on foot-related medical care than on ammunition in some months. The irony wasn't lost on medical officers. Expensive American boots were creating medical costs that exceeded the boots' purchase price many times over. Some forward-thinking medical officers began quietly recommending tire sandals to soldiers under their care. Captain Hayes found himself in the awkward position of prescribing non-regulation footwear as medical treatment. In my professional medical opinion, he wrote in one report, continued use of current jungle boots by soldiers with chronic foot conditions constitutes a threat to their health and military effectiveness. The medical evidence extended beyond simple statistics to include photographic documentation. That was impossible to dispute. Comparison photographs showing healthy Vietnamese feet alongside infected American feet became powerful evidence that the problem wasn't environmental or genetic. It was equipment-related, military. Medical research facilities began conducting studies that confirmed what field medics already knew. Laboratory analysis of jungle boot materials showed that the leather and waterproofing compounds created ideal environments for bacterial and fungal growth when saturated with moisture. The supposedly advanced materials, science was actually working against soldiers' health. The final piece of medical evidence came from American soldiers who had switched to tire sandals against regulations. Their foot health improved dramatically within weeks of making the change, providing clear proof that the equipment, not the environment, was causing the medical problems plaguing American forces. The underground network of tire sandal acquisition began operating like a military intelligence operation, complete with code words, secret suppliers, and careful operational security. Soldiers couldn't openly defy equipment regulations, but they also couldn't ignore the evidence of their own feet. The result was a parallel supply system that operated in the shadows of official military logistics. Private. Rodriguez became an inadvertent expert in the tire, sandal black market during his tour with the 25th Infantry Division. You had to know who to talk to and what to say, he later recalled. There was this kid near Cu Chi who made sandals specifically for GIs. He knew our foot sizes, he used different strapping patterns that worked better with American feet, and he charged 2 packs of cigarettes per pair. The network extended throughout American units in Vietnam, with soldiers sharing information about reliable suppliers, quality standards, and techniques for concealing unauthorized footwear. Some enterprising Vietnamese entrepreneurs began specializing in military-grade tire sandals that incorporated features specifically requested by American customers. Sergeant Thompson, a supply NCO with the 1st Cavalry Division, found himself in an impossible position. His official responsibilities required him to ensure soldiers were properly equipped with issued gear, but his practical experience told him that the issued gear was inadequate. I couldn't officially tell soldiers to buy local footwear, he explained, but I could make sure they knew where to find the good suppliers and what to look for in quality construction. The concealment techniques became increasingly sophisticated as commanders cracked down on unauthorized equipment. Soldiers developed elaborate systems for switching between jungle boots and tire sandals depending on whether they were likely to encounter officers or inspections. Some units established sandal caches at forward positions where soldiers could change footwear before patrols. Company commanders found themselves caught between conflicting pressures. Higher headquarters insisted on strict adherence to equipment regulations, while their soldiers' health and effectiveness depended on violating those same regulations. Captain Morrison, commanding a rifle company in the 101st Airborne, developed an unofficial don't ask, don't tell policy regarding footwear. I couldn't officially authorize non-regulation equipment, Captain Morrison later explained, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that soldiers wearing tire sandals had better foot health, moved more quietly, and were more effective in patrol operations. So I made it clear that what soldiers wore in the field was their business, as long as they had proper equipment for inspections. The resistance from military bureaucracy was swift and predictable. A directive issued by MACV headquarters in July 1967 reminded all personnel that wearing non-regulation footwear constitutes a violation of uniform regulations and reflects poorly on military discipline and unit cohesion. The directive specifically mentioned tire sandals as examples of inappropriate equipment. This official response created even greater tensions between field personnel and rear echelon commanders. Staff Sergeant O'Brien, now on his second pair of failing jungle boots, wrote acidly in his journal, "The people writing these directives are sitting in air-conditioned offices in Saigon while we're dealing with equipment that's literally falling apart on our feet. Easy to maintain discipline when your biggest challenge is finding a cold beer." Some soldiers began openly challenging the regulations, willing to accept disciplinary action rather than continue damaging their feet. Private First Class Williams was written up for appearing at morning inspection wearing tire sandals, but he refused to change back to jungle boots despite threats of court-martial. "Write me up all you want," he told his platoon sergeant, "but I'm not going to cripple myself for the sake of regulations that don't work." The most creative adaptations came from soldiers who figured out ways to modify their jungle boots to incorporate features from tire sandals. Some cut drainage holes in the sides, others removed the waterproof lining, and a few enterprising soldiers even grafted tire tread patterns onto boot soles using captured enemy equipment and improvised tools. Medical officers found themselves in particularly difficult positions, caught between their professional responsibility to soldiers' health and military requirements to support official equipment policies. Many began writing careful medical recommendations that stopped just short of explicitly endorsing unauthorized footwear while making clear that current equipment was causing preventable injuries. The psychological impact on unit cohesion was complex and unpredictable. In some cases, shared resistance to ineffective regulations actually strengthened bonds between soldiers who felt they were looking out for each other against an uncaring bureaucracy. In other cases, the stress of constant rule-breaking and fear of punishment created tension and mistrust. Forward deployed units, who spent the most time in direct contact with Vietnamese conditions and personnel, showed the highest rates of unauthorized footwear use. Rear area units, where regulations were more strictly enforced and environmental conditions were less challenging, maintained higher compliance with official equipment requirements. The adaptation phenomenon extended beyond individual soldiers to entire units that developed informal policies for dealing with equipment failures. Some companies established equipment maintenance procedures that were actually sophisticated systems for acquiring and distributing locally made alternatives to failed military gear. The moment that crystallized the tire sandal lesson for many American soldiers came during Operation Junction City in September 1967. Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry was conducting a search and destroy mission in the Dancing jungle near the Cambodian border when their equipment failures nearly resulted in a tactical disaster that would have been entirely preventable. The patrol had been moving through swampy terrain for 6 hours when Staff Sergeant O'Brien's jungle boots finally gave up completely. The sole separated from the upper, leaving him essentially barefoot in hostile territory. Within minutes, 3 other soldiers in his squad experienced similar boot failures, their expensive military footwear literally falling apart under conditions it was designed to handle. We were 12 clicks from extraction in Indian country, and suddenly a quarter of my squad was barefoot, O'Brien later reported. Meanwhile, our Vietnamese scout was moving through the same terrain like it was a sidewalk, his tire sandals showing no signs of wear after 8 hours of hard patrol. The situation became critical when enemy contact was initiated. The soldiers with failed boots couldn't move effectively, limiting the squad's tactical options and putting the entire unit at risk. They were forced to establish a defensive position and call for immediate extraction instead of completing their mission. The after-action report noted that equipment failure compromised mission, effectiveness, and endangered personnel. What made the situation particularly frustrating was that several soldiers in the unit had acquired tire sandals but were afraid to wear them on an official operation. Private Chen later wrote, "I had a perfectly good pair of tire sandals in my pack, but regulations said I had to wear the jungle boots that I knew were going to fail. So I followed orders and nearly got myself and my buddies killed as a result." The tactical implications of the equipment failure went beyond just individual mobility. Soldiers wearing failed boots made more noise, moved more slowly, couldn't maintain proper tactical spacing. Their compromised movement patterns were easier for enemy forces to track and predict. In essence, the boot failures were creating tactical disadvantages that could be exploited by Vietnamese forces. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, the battalion commander, found himself writing an after-action report that was both professionally devastating and personally embarrassing. Mission failure was directly attributable to equipment malfunction, he wrote. Personnel were unable to complete assigned tasks due to systematic failure of issued footwear. Alternative equipment solutions exist, but are not authorized for use. The incident prompted an unofficial policy change at battalion level. Patterson quietly informed his company commanders that soldiers' safety and mission effectiveness take precedence over equipment regulations. While not explicitly authorizing tire sandals, the message was clear. Commanders would not be held accountable for soldiers' footwear choices, if those choices improved operational effectiveness. Word of the Junction City incident spread rapidly through informal communication networks that connected units across Vietnam. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind adherence to regulations that didn't match battlefield realities. More importantly, it provided cover for other commanders who wanted to allow their soldiers more flexibility in equipment choices. Captain Williams, now commanding a company in the 1st Infantry Division, used the Patterson precedent to establish his own unofficial footwear policy. I told my platoon leaders that their job was to bring their soldiers home alive and mission capable, he later explained. If that meant wearing captured enemy equipment, so be it. I'd rather explain unauthorized gear than write letters to dead soldiers' families. The psychological turning point was perhaps more significant than the tactical one. American soldiers had been taught that following regulations and using issued equipment was synonymous with military professionalism and effectiveness. The Junction City incident proved that blind adherence to failed policies could be not just counterproductive, but actually dangerous. Sergeant Morrison, who had witnessed the entire sequence of events, wrote in his journal, "Today we learned that sometimes being a good soldier means breaking bad rules. The Vietnamese scout who kept us alive was wearing tire sandals that probably cost less than a pack of cigarettes. Our $50 boots nearly got us killed. There's a lesson in that." The incident also highlighted the broader problem of military institutions' resistance to acknowledging mistakes or adapting to new realities. Despite clear evidence that jungle boots were failing systematically, official policy remained unchanged. Soldiers were being forced to choose between following regulations and staying alive, a choice that no military organization should impose on its personnel. The ripple effects of Junction City extended far beyond Alpha Company. The story was repeated in letters home, shared in informal conversations between units, and eventually reached the attention of journalists and congressional staff members who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about military procurement and soldier welfare. For Staff Sergeant O'Brien, the incident marked the final abandonment of faith in military equipment superiority. I realized that day that everything they taught us about American technology being better was just propaganda, he later recalled. Sometimes the simple solution really is the best solution, regardless of how much money you spent on the alternative. The systematic failure of jungle boots revealed fundamental flaws in American military engineering philosophy that extended far beyond footwear. The tire sandal lesson became a case study in the dangers of over-engineering solutions without understanding the actual operating environment or consulting with end users who had to live with the consequences. The military-industrial complex had approached the jungle boot problem with typical American confidence in technological solutions. Engineers assumed that more expensive materials, more complex manufacturing processes, and more sophisticated design features would automatically produce superior results. They never seriously considered that simpler solutions might be more effective for specific applications. The design process itself revealed institutional blindness to local knowledge and conditions. American engineers conducted extensive testing in controlled laboratory environments and limited field trials in locations like Panama and Louisiana. But they never consulted with people who had actually lived and worked in Vietnamese jungles for generations. The assumption was that American technical knowledge was automatically superior to indigenous experience. Dr. Richard Stevens, a material scientist who worked on the Jungle Boot project for a major defense contractor, later admitted the fundamental error in their approach. We were solving the wrong problem. We focused on creating boots that met our specifications for durability, waterproofing, and military appearance. We never asked whether those specifications were appropriate for the actual conditions soldiers would face. The cost-benefit analysis that justified the Jungle Boot program was based on faulty assumptions about performance and longevity. Military planners assumed that expensive, sophisticated equipment would last longer and perform better than simple alternatives. The reality was exactly the opposite. Tire sandals that cost virtually nothing outperformed boots that represented significant investment in research, development, and manufacturing. The over-engineering problem extended to fundamental design philosophy. American military culture valued standardization, complexity, and technological sophistication as inherent goods. The idea that a simpler, locally adapted solution might be superior challenged core assumptions about American technical supremacy and military effectiveness. Manufacturing requirements added additional layers of complexity that actually reduced performance. Jungle boots had to be produced in standardized facilities, using approved materials and meeting detailed military specifications. This process made them expensive, difficult to modify, and impossible to adapt to local conditions. Tire sandals, by contrast, could be manufactured anywhere using available materials and customized for individual users or specific conditions. The procurement system itself created perverse incentives that favored expensive, complex solutions over effective ones. Defense contractors made more money from sophisticated products with high development costs and complex manufacturing requirements. There was no financial incentive to develop simple, inexpensive solutions that actually worked better in field conditions. Quality control procedures that were supposed to ensure boot reliability actually masked fundamental design problems. Testing protocols focused on measurable characteristics like water resistance, material strength, and manufacturing tolerances. But these tests didn't predict how the boots would perform in actual use by soldiers carrying heavy loads through tropical environments for extended periods. The intellectual hubris was perhaps more damaging than the engineering failures. American military planners couldn't accept that Vietnamese peasants might have developed superior solutions to problems that American engineers had struggled with for years. This cultural blindness prevented the military from learning from obvious examples of appropriate technology that were literally walking around in front of them. The comparison with Vietnamese design philosophy was instructive. Vietnamese craftsmen started with the operating environment and available materials, then developed solutions that worked within those constraints. American engineers started with theoretical specifications and tried to force environmental conditions to conform to their designs through technological brute force. The feedback mechanisms that might have corrected these problems were systematically ignored or suppressed. Soldiers' reports of equipment failures were dismissed as improper maintenance or unrealistic expectations. Field commanders' requests for alternative equipment were rejected as violations of standardization policies. Medical officers' documentation of equipment-related injuries was attributed to environmental factors rather than design flaws, the institutional response. To the tire sandal lesson was defensive rather than adaptive. Instead of acknowledging that American engineering had failed to solve a basic problem that Vietnamese craftsmen had addressed successfully, military leaders blamed environmental conditions, soldier maintenance, and everything except the fundamental design philosophy that had created the problem. The broader implications extended to other military equipment and doctrine. If American engineers could be so wrong about something as basic as footwear, what other assumptions about technological superiority might be incorrect? The tire sandal lesson was beginning to crack the foundation of American military confidence in ways that would have strategic implications for the entire Vietnam conflict. The tire sandal revelation triggered a broader examination of American military equipment and doctrine that would have consequences far beyond footwear. Soldiers who had learned to question official claims about boot superiority began applying the same skeptical analysis to other gear, weapons, and tactical procedures that weren't performing as advertised. The M16 rifle became the next obvious target for comparison with enemy equipment. American soldiers had been issued what was supposedly the most advanced infantry weapon in the world, featuring lightweight materials, high-velocity ammunition, and sophisticated manufacturing. Yet many soldiers observed that AK-47s captured from enemy forces continued functioning in conditions that caused M16s to jam repeatedly. Staff Sergeant O'Brien, now skeptical of all military equipment claims, began keeping detailed records of weapon reliability during patrol operations. The AK works when it's covered in mud, when it's been underwater, when it hasn't been cleaned for weeks, he noted in his journal. Our M16s jam if you look at them wrong. Same pattern as the boots. More expensive and sophisticated doesn't mean better. Communication equipment presented similar contradictions. American radios were technologically advanced, but required careful handling, frequent maintenance, and specific environmental conditions to function properly. Vietnamese forces used simpler communication methods that were less vulnerable to environmental conditions and electronic countermeasures. The questioning extended to tactical doctrine itself. American military procedures emphasized standardized responses, complex coordination, and heavy reliance on technological support. Vietnamese tactics, by contrast, were flexible, adaptive, and based on intimate knowledge of local terrain and conditions. Soldiers began wondering whether American tactical sophistication might actually be a disadvantage in Vietnamese conditions. Private Chen, who had initially been impressed by American military organization, wrote to his family, "Everything here is backwards from what they taught us. The enemy moves faster with less equipment, fights better with simpler weapons, and survives better with basic gear. Makes you wonder if we're the ones who don't know what we're doing." Medical equipment provided another example of the pattern. American field medical kits were comprehensive and technologically advanced, but they were also heavy, complex, and dependent on supply chains that could be disrupted. Vietnamese medical practices used local plants and traditional techniques that were lighter, more available, and often more effective for common battlefield injuries. The psychological impact on military morale was significant and troubling. American soldiers' confidence in their equipment and training was being systematically undermined by daily exposure to superior enemy solutions. The tire sandal lesson had opened a crack in military faith that was widening to encompass fundamental questions about American military effectiveness. Unit commanders found themselves dealing with soldiers who were increasingly willing to improvise solutions and ignore official procedures when those procedures didn't work. This presented complex leadership challenges. How do you maintain discipline and cohesion when official policies are demonstrably counterproductive? Captain Williams observed the changing attitudes in his company with mixed feelings. On one hand, my soldiers were becoming more adaptive and creative, which made them more effective in combat. On the other hand, they were losing respect for military authority and standard procedures, which could be dangerous in situations where discipline really mattered. The ripple effect reached beyond individual equipment to question entire strategic assumptions. If American technological superiority was largely illusory, what did that mean for a war strategy based on overwhelming enemy forces through superior firepower and equipment? The tire sandal lesson was suggesting that Vietnamese forces might have systematic advantages that American planners had never recognized. Intelligence. Officers began paying more attention to enemy equipment and techniques, trying to understand why simple Vietnamese solutions were outperforming sophisticated American alternatives. Some began quietly recommending that American forces adopt enemy techniques and equipment when they proved superior to American equivalents. The cultural implications were perhaps most significant. American soldiers had been raised with unquestioning faith in American technological superiority as a core element of national identity. The tire sandal lesson was forcing them to confront the possibility that American approaches weren't automatically better, and that they might have something to learn from people they had been taught to view as primitive and backward. The institutional response was predictably defensive. Rather than systematically examining other equipment and doctrine for similar problems, military leadership focused on damage control and maintaining confidence in American superiority. Official communications emphasized isolated successes while downplaying systematic failures. This defensive response actually made the problem worse by creating a credibility gap between official claims and soldiers' daily experience. The more military leaders insisted that American equipment was superior, the more obvious it became to soldiers that their leaders were either ignorant of battlefield realities or deliberately misleading them. The tire sandal lesson was becoming a symbol of broader problems with American military culture. Over-reliance on technology, resistance to learning from local knowledge, and institutional inability to admit mistakes or adapt to new realities. These cultural problems would have strategic consequences that extended far beyond the Vietnam conflict. The Pentagon's response to mounting evidence of Jungle Boot failure revealed the institutional mechanisms that prevented military organizations from learning from their mistakes. Rather than acknowledging problems and seeking solutions, the military bureaucracy activated defensive systems designed to protect careers, budgets, and institutional prestige at the expense of soldier welfare and operational effectiveness. The first layer of denial involved redefining the problem to make it appear manageable rather than systematic. A Pentagon memorandum from August 1967 characterized boot failures as isolated incidents resulting from extreme environmental stresses beyond normal operational parameters. This language transformed a systemic equipment failure into an environmental problem that was nobody's responsibility to solve. Military procurement officials had powerful incentives to deny the scope of boot failures. Acknowledging systematic problems would require expensive recalls, contract renegotiations, and congressional explanations that could damage careers and budgets. Colonel James Harrison, chief of footwear procurement, wrote in an internal memo, "Admitting widespread boot failures would undermine confidence in our entire procurement system and provide ammunition to defense budget critics." The institutional response included elaborate face-saving measures designed to maintain the appearance of American technological superiority. A new improved Jungle Boot was announced with great fanfare, featuring minor modifications that addressed none of the fundamental design problems. This allowed officials to claim they were responding to soldier concerns while actually changing nothing significant. Scientific testing was manipulated to support predetermined conclusions about boot performance. Laboratory tests were conducted under controlled conditions that bore little resemblance to actual field use in Vietnam. When tests were conducted, in more realistic conditions, the parameters were adjusted until the results supported official positions about boot effectiveness. The most cynical aspect of the institutional denial was the continued investment in failed systems despite clear evidence of their inadequacy. New contracts worth millions of dollars were signed for Jungle Boots that everyone knew would fail in field conditions. This represented a deliberate choice to protect institutional interests rather than soldier welfare. Communication strategies were developed to discredit soldier complaints and maintain public confidence in military equipment. Press releases emphasized the sophisticated engineering and rigorous testing behind Jungle Boot development while ignoring field reports of systematic failures. Soldiers who spoke publicly about equipment problems were sometimes subjected to disciplinary action for undermining unit morale. The bureaucratic language used to discuss the crisis was carefully crafted to obscure rather than illuminate the true scope of the problem. Equipment performance variability replaced systematic failure. Environmental stress factors replaced inadequate design. User maintenance issues replaced equipment that doesn't work as advertised. Congressional oversight was deflected through a combination of technical complexity and classification restrictions. When legislators asked pointed questions about jungle boot performance, they received detailed briefings on materials science and manufacturing processes that obscured the simple fact that the boots were falling apart on soldiers' feet. Sensitive. Field reports were classified to prevent congressional access to damaging evidence. The contrast with Vietnamese institutional responses was instructive. When Vietnamese forces encountered equipment or tactical problems, they adapted quickly and pragmatically. American institutional culture, by contrast, prioritized maintaining, face, and protecting bureaucratic interests over solving operational problems. General William Westmoreland, commander of American forces in Vietnam, was briefed regularly on equipment problems and seemed more concerned with public relations than soldier welfare. His public statements continued to emphasize American technological advantages, while private communications revealed awareness of systematic equipment failures. The denial mechanisms extended to medical evidence that should have forced acknowledgement of the problem. When field hospitals reported epidemic levels of foot-related casualties, the response was to blame soldier hygiene and tropical conditions, rather than acknowledge that American boots were causing preventable injuries. The human cost of institutional denial was measured in unnecessary casualties, reduced operational effectiveness, and damaged morale among soldiers who realized their leaders were more concerned with bureaucratic face-saving than with their welfare. Soldiers began to understand that institutional loyalty didn't flow both ways. They were expected to risk their lives for the organization, but the organization wouldn't risk embarrassment to protect them. Some junior officers found themselves caught between institutional pressure and professional responsibility. Lieutenant Michael Roberts, a platoon leader with the 173rd Airborne, wrote in his diary, "I'm supposed to enforce regulations that I know are damaging my soldiers' health and combat effectiveness. Either I follow orders and hurt my men, or I protect my men and violate orders. This is not a choice any officer should have to make." The long-term consequences of institutional denial extended far beyond the immediate equipment problems. Soldiers learned not to trust official claims about equipment performance, tactical doctrine, or strategic objectives. This erosion of trust would have lasting effects on military effectiveness and civil-military relations that would persist long after the Vietnam conflict ended. The tire sandal lesson became a symbol of institutional failure that went beyond mere equipment problems to encompass fundamental questions about military culture, leadership accountability, and the relationship between individual soldiers and the bureaucratic systems that controlled their lives. As American involvement in Vietnam wound down in the early 1970s, veterans returning home carried with them lessons that extended far beyond military tactics or political strategy. The tire sandal revelation had become part of a broader education about the limitations of American technological superiority and the dangers of cultural arrogance that would influence their perspectives for decades to come. Staff Sergeant O'Brien, now a veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, reflected on the transformation in his thinking during his final weeks in country. "I came here believing that American technology and organization made us automatically superior to anyone we might fight," he wrote in his journal. "I'm leaving with the knowledge that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones, and that we have a lot to learn from people we thought we could teach." The post-war analysis conducted by military historians and policy researchers confirmed what soldiers had experienced firsthand. American assumptions about technological superiority had been systematically wrong. The Rand Corporation's classified study of equipment effectiveness in Vietnam documented hundreds of cases where simple enemy solutions had outperformed sophisticated American alternatives. Dr. Andrew Thompson, a military historian who interviewed dozens of Vietnam veterans for his research, found that the tire sandal lesson had profoundly influenced their worldview. These soldiers came home with a healthy skepticism about official claims and technological solutions. They had learned that expensive and complex doesn't automatically mean better, and that local knowledge often trumps theoretical expertise. The broader implications for American military doctrine were slowly being acknowledged by thoughtful military planners. The tire sandal lesson, along with similar revelations about other equipment and tactics, suggested that American military culture needed fundamental changes in how it approached technological development and strategic planning. Some veterans channeled their Vietnam experiences into civilian careers that emphasized appropriate technology and cultural sensitivity. Former soldiers became engineers, designers, and managers who questioned assumptions about complexity and sophistication that had dominated American thinking during the Cold War era. The irony wasn't lost on veterans who returned to an America that was experiencing its own technological awakening. The same period that saw American military technology failing in Vietnamese jungles also witnessed the emergence of Silicon Valley and the personal computer revolution. Some veterans recognized parallels between Vietnamese tire sandals and the simple, elegant solutions that were transforming American technology. Private Chen, now a civilian engineer in California, drew explicit connections between his Vietnam experience and his professional work. The tire sandal lesson taught me to always ask whether a sophisticated solution is really better than a simple one. In the tech industry, we call it elegant simplicity, finding the minimal solution that actually solves the problem. The psychological impact on veterans was complex and lasting. Many struggled with cognitive dissonance between their military training, which had emphasized American superiority, and their battlefield experience, which had taught them humility. Some found it easier to compartmentalize the experience rather than confront its broader implications for American culture and foreign policy. Medical follow-up studies of Vietnam veterans revealed that soldiers who had switched to tire sandals during their tours showed significantly better long-term foot health than those who had used only military boots. This provided additional post-war evidence that the equipment failures had been systematic rather than anecdotal. The tire sandals themselves became symbolic artifacts that veterans brought home as souvenirs and reminders of hard-learned lessons. Museums began collecting these simple rubber sandals as examples of appropriate technology and symbols of American military learning experiences in Southeast Asia. Congressional investigations in the mid-1970s finally acknowledged what soldiers had been reporting for years. The Jungle Boot program had been a systematic failure that had unnecessarily endangered American personnel and wasted millions of taxpayer dollars. The investigations revealed the institutional mechanisms that had prevented military leaders from acknowledging and addressing obvious problems. Some military leaders attempted to reframe the tire sandal lesson as evidence of American adaptability and learning capacity. General Frederick Wyand, one of the last American commanders in Vietnam, argued that the military's eventual acceptance of local solutions demonstrated institutional flexibility and responsiveness to soldier needs. This revisionist interpretation was rejected by many veterans who had lived through the years of institutional denial and resistance. Staff Sergeant Morrison, now retired, responded bluntly, "They didn't learn from us. We learned despite them. The institution fought us every step of the way when we tried to tell them their equipment didn't work." The long-term impact on American military culture was subtle but significant. Subsequent conflicts saw greater attention to soldier feedback, more realistic equipment testing, and increased willingness to adopt foreign solutions when they proved superior to American alternatives. The tire sandal lesson had become part of institutional memory, even if it was never officially acknowledged. For many veterans, the tire sandal revelation remained a touchstone for evaluating claims about American superiority and technological advancement. It had taught them to question assumptions, value practical experience over theoretical knowledge, and respect the wisdom that could be found in unexpected places. The tire sandal lesson's influence on modern military thinking became evident in subsequent conflicts, where American forces demonstrated greater openness to local solutions and appropriate technology. The painful learning experience in Vietnam had created institutional memory that influenced equipment development and tactical doctrine for decades to come. During the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, American military advisors supporting Afghan Mujahideen fighters explicitly recommended that they continue using traditional footwear rather than switching to Western military boots. The lessons learned? In Vietnam, it taught planners that local solutions were often superior for fighters operating in familiar terrain with limited logistical support. The development of modern military footwear reflected hard-learned lessons from the tire sandal debacle. Contemporary combat boots incorporate design principles that Vietnamese craftsmen had understood intuitively: drainage systems, lightweight materials, flexible construction, and climate-appropriate materials. Military contractors were forced to abandon their assumptions about the superiority of complex, expensive solutions. Colonel James Murphy, who worked on military footwear development in the 1980s, explicitly acknowledged the Vietnam influence. The Jungle Boot failure taught us that we had to start with the operating environment and work backward to design solutions. We couldn't just assume that more expensive meant better or that American manufacturing techniques were automatically superior to local knowledge. The concept of appropriate technology gained acceptance in military planning circles partly because of lessons learned from Vietnamese innovations. Military planners began systematically studying enemy equipment and techniques, looking for simple solutions that might be superior to American alternatives. This represented a fundamental shift from the technological arrogance that had characterized earlier military thinking. Modern special operations forces embraced the tire sandal lesson more completely than conventional military units. Special operators routinely used locally made equipment when it proved superior to American alternatives, and they were trained to evaluate solutions based on effectiveness rather than institutional preferences or national origin. The influence extended beyond military applications to civilian industries and design philosophy. Engineers and designers who had learned the tire sandal lesson during military service brought those insights into civilian careers, where they influenced product development in fields ranging from outdoor recreation to industrial safety equipment. The sandals themselves became collector's items and museum artifacts that told the story of American military learning. The National Museum of the United States Army includes Vietnamese tire sandals in its Vietnam War exhibit with explanatory text that acknowledges their superiority to American jungle boots for tropical conditions. Modern military training began incorporating case studies of the tire sandal lesson as examples of the importance of cultural awareness and the dangers of technological hubris. Officer education programs use the jungle boot failure as a cautionary tale about making assumptions regarding enemy capabilities and the value of local knowledge. The lesson influenced American military involvement in subsequent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Military planners made conscious efforts to study local conditions, consult with indigenous personnel, and remain open to solutions that challenged American assumptions about technological superiority. However, the institutional memory was imperfect and incomplete. Some of the same patterns that led to the jungle boot debacle were repeated in later conflicts, suggesting that military institutions had difficulty maintaining institutional learning. Across generations of personnel and leadership changes, the tire sandal story became part of popular military culture, told and retold in training environments, professional military education courses, and informal conversations among service members. It served as a cautionary tale about overconfidence and a reminder of the value of listening to frontline personnel who actually had to use the equipment in field conditions. Contemporary military equipment development processes now include more extensive field testing, greater consultation with end users, and systematic evaluation of foreign solutions that might be superior to American alternatives. While these improvements didn't eliminate all equipment problems, they represented institutional learning from the Vietnam experience. The broader cultural impact extended to American attitudes toward foreign innovation and local knowledge. The tire sandal lesson contributed to growing awareness that other cultures might have superior solutions to problems that Americans hadn't. Even recognized challenging assumptions about automatic American superiority in all technological domains. Modern military leaders occasionally reference the tire sandal lesson when advocating for humility, adaptability, and openness to learning from unexpected sources. It became a standard example in leadership training about the importance of listening to subordinates and questioning institutional assumptions. The legacy remained relevant in contemporary conflicts, where American forces operated in unfamiliar environments against opponents who understood local conditions better than foreign invaders. The fundamental lesson that simple, locally adapted solutions might outperform sophisticated imported alternatives continued to influence military planning and equipment development decisions. March 15, 2017, exactly 50 years after Staff Sergeant O'Brien first stared down at his rotting jungle boots in disbelief, he stood in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Museum in San Antonio, examining a display case containing the very tire, sandals that had taught him one of life's most important lessons. Now, 71 years old, O'Brien smiled wryly as he read the exhibit placard that finally acknowledged what he and thousands of other soldiers had known 5 decades earlier. The display was titled Appropriate Technology, Vietnamese Innovations That Outperformed American Equipment. It featured tire sandals, bamboo punji stakes, and other simple Vietnamese solutions alongside their expensive American counterparts. The museum's description was diplomatically worded but unambiguous. Vietnamese forces often demonstrated superior practical solutions to environmental challenges facing all combatants in Southeast Asia. O'Brien's granddaughter, a recent graduate of MIT's engineering program, listened with fascination as he explained the technical superiority of the tire sandals. "Grandpa," she said, "you're describing exactly what we call design thinking. In engineering school, starting with user needs and environmental constraints, rather than trying to force sophisticated solutions onto inappropriate problems." The irony wasn't lost on O'Brien that his granddaughter was learning as revolutionary concepts the same lessons that Vietnamese peasants had understood intuitively for generations. "We could have saved a lot of money and suffering if we just asked the right questions in the first place," he reflected. "But I suppose every generation has to learn some lessons the hard way." Dr. Michael Chen, formerly Private Chen of the 25th Infantry Division, had become a successful technology executive in Silicon Valley. His company's design philosophy explicitly incorporated lessons learned from Vietnamese tire sandals. Maximum functionality with minimum complexity, local adaptation over standardized solutions, and user experience over engineering elegance. "Everything I know about good design I learned from a Vietnamese farmer wearing recycled tires," he often told his engineering teams. The tire sandal lesson had become required reading in multiple military academies and business schools as an example of the dangers of technological arrogance and the value of appropriate technology. Harvard Business School used the case study in courses on international business and cross-cultural management, while West Point included it in leadership curricula about the importance of questioning assumptions and learning from unexpected sources. Doc Morrison, now retired from a long career as a civilian emergency physician, still recommended simple solutions over complex ones when treating patients. The tire sandal lesson taught me that the most sophisticated treatment isn't always the best treatment, he explained to younger colleagues. Sometimes the simple solution that actually works is better than the complex solution that looks impressive but fails in practice. The Vietnamese perspective on the tire sandal story was characteristically pragmatic. Nguyen Van Duke, the former guide who had unknowingly taught American soldiers about appropriate technology, was interviewed by military historians in 2010. "We were surprised that Americans found our sandals so interesting," he said through a translator. "We made them because we needed footwear and tires were available. It wasn't complicated, just practical. Modern military procurement. Officials occasionally referenced the tire sandal debacle when advocating for more realistic testing procedures and greater attention to user feedback." Colonel Sarah Williams, granddaughter of the Vietnam-era medic who had documented the boot failures, worked in Pentagon acquisition programs, kept a pair of Vietnamese tire sandals on her desk as a reminder of the importance of questioning institutional assumptions. The cultural impact extended beyond military circles to influence American attitudes toward innovation and foreign knowledge. The tire sandal story contributed to growing recognition that other cultures might have superior solutions to common problems, challenging assumptions about automatic American technological superiority that had dominated Cold War thinking. In 2019, a major American outdoor equipment manufacturer began marketing sandals explicitly based on Vietnamese tire sandal design principles. The marketing materials acknowledged the inspiration and included testimonials from Vietnam veterans about the superior performance of the original design. The irony of American companies now copying Vietnamese innovations that they had once dismissed as primitive was not lost on veterans who had lived through the original experience. Staff Sergeant O'Brien's final journal entry, written on the 50th anniversary of his first encounter with tire sandals, captured the enduring significance of the lesson. "Those sandals taught me that wisdom can come from anywhere, that simple solutions are often the best solutions, and that admitting you're wrong is the first step toward being right. I've tried to remember that lesson every day since Vietnam." The tire sandal story had become part of American military folklore, a cautionary tale passed down through generations of service members about the importance of humility, adaptability, and respect for local knowledge. It served as a permanent reminder that, in warfare, as in life, the last laugh often belongs to those who find simple solutions to complex problems. For the Vietnamese people who had unknowingly taught American soldiers these lessons, the recognition was long overdue but deeply satisfying. Their practical wisdom, born of necessity and refined by generations of experience, had finally received acknowledgement from the very institutions that had once dismissed it as primitive improvisation. Sometimes, the best technology really is the simplest technology that actually works.